again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Let me introduce myself. I'm Chef Araminta. I lead the culinary team here at Season Health. For those of you who may not be familiar with Season, welcome. To tell you a little bit about what we do here at Season, we offer personalized nutrition programs that help you learn to eat healthier without giving up delicious food. We provide virtual visits with registered dietitians, tips and guidance on nutrition, navigating health conditions, and cooking. We offer thousands of chef-created and condition-specific recipes, as well as affordable pre-made meals. As head of culinary, I'm responsible for developing and testing Season's recipes, and part of that process is making sure that all flavors are shining through. Since we are conscious of sodium levels, there's a lot of focus on boosting flavorful ingredients like ginger, garlic, chilies, acids, spices, and of course, herbs, today's topic. Fresh and dried herbs are essential to cooking, not only for their flavor, aroma, and visual appeal, but also for their nutritional benefits. We'll have about 30 minutes together today where I'll talk through some of these benefits, as well as the differences between fresh and dried herbs, how and when to cook with them, and substitutions. Then you'll join me in the kitchen where I'll show you a few ways to keep fresh herbs from going bad so dang fast, and a few other tips and tricks. There'll be a Q&A at the end, so please add any questions you have about herbs by clicking on the Q&A icon in the Zoom taskbar at the bottom of your screen, or in the chat if that's easier. And my trusty colleague, Jess, will make sure I see those. Thank you, Jess. Also, this recording will be available and shared out afterward. So to get started, I'm curious, what is everyone's favorite herb to cook with or eat? You can type it right in the chat. It can be fresh or dried or a blend. Curious to hear from you. Get some thyme and rosemary. We'll be doing a little demonstration on thyme later, and basil. Cumin, turmeric, cilantro, and basil, all very good. Olive oil, yes. The herb of my heart. We use that in everything. Anyone else? Ooh, thyme, yeah, the thyme seems to be a popular one. So it looks like a few of you mentioned things like cumin, and I thought I saw someone add cinnamon on here. So these are, ooh, sage, that's a good one. So cumin is actually a spice, and I was actually hoping that someone was going to mention a spice here because herbs and spices are often paired together, and it's a great opportunity to start things off with the question, what is the difference between herbs and spices? Herbs and spices are grouped together because they both come from plants. They add tons of flavor to cooking and are usually packaged similarly. The difference is that herbs are the leaves or stems of the plant, while spices come from the roots, nuts, bark, or seeds of the plant. Cinnamon, for example, is actually from the bark of the cinnamon tree, which is pretty cool. Another example is cilantro and coriander. Cilantro is the leafy part of the plant, and coriander is the seed of the coriander plant. So also worth noting is that cilantro is called fresh coriander in the UK and Europe. The more you know. Herbs hold a wealth of benefits. A few speckles of herbs in a dish may seem inconsequential to your health, but it's a good practice to add them to dishes because they do add up and they do add a ton of flavor. Herbs aid in digestion, especially cilantro, parsley, and mint. Another way to benefit is through herbal teas. I like to drink mint tea after a big meal to help with digestion. Pretty cool that you can eat or drink your herbs. Herbs such as oregano and cilantro might help lower cholesterol. Almost all herbs, especially cilantro, oregano, basil, rosemary, and thyme, are rich in antioxidants, which protect cells from free radicals and reduce inflammation. This is helpful in preventing and treating chronic disease. Some other herbal superpowers include oregano for sore throats and coughs, rosemary for mood and memory, basil for reducing high blood sugar levels, parsley for bone density health and to reduce swelling, and cilantro to improve sleep. Not to mention the loads of the beneficial vitamins and minerals herbs contain. So we know that herbs are good for us. Let's talk about the different types of herbs. They can be categorized into two groups, leafy and woody. Leafy herbs are soft, bright in color with tender green stems like basil, parsley, and mint, to name a few. They tend to have a more delicate flavor and texture, and the sky's the limit on how much of them you choose to add to your dish. Woody herbs have thicker twig-like stems and hardier leaves like thyme, rosemary, and oregano. These are tougher and generally too strong in flavor to eat raw. These are usually better cooked, but we'll get into that in a little bit. Knowing the difference between leafy and woody herbs is a good way to know which herbs are better fresh versus dried. Leafy herbs are 80% water, so they are always going to be better in flavor and texture when fresh. If you're making an uncooked dish like a salad or sandwich or condiment, fresh is better. Imagine a tomato and mozzarella salad with dried basil or guacamole with dried cilantro. It just wouldn't be the same. If a recipe calls for fresh herbs to be cooked, it's almost always at the very end of the cooking process to retain the flavor, or as a garnish for a pop of color and aroma. Since woody herbs are already a bit tough, they lend themselves very well to being dried and rehydrated in the cooking process. If you're making something that is going to simmer away on the stove or in the oven, like a soup or a stew, maybe a casserole or your Thanksgiving gravy, yep, that's just around the corner, my friends, go ahead and use dried herbs. They'll need time and moisture to really release their flavor, so they are most commonly added at the beginning of the cooking process. And when you do add them, instead of just sprinkling them in the pot, try rubbing the dried herbs between your fingers to crush them a little bit, which will help release some of their oils and add a big dose of flavor. This is especially helpful when cooking with bay leaves. Tearing them in half will really unlock their flavor. So to recap, leafy herbs are better fresh and when added at the end of cooking, where woody herbs are great in their dried form and benefit from adding earlier in the cooking process to better develop their flavor. These are some examples of herbs that are most common in seasoned recipes. Go to town on these herbs. You are encouraged to adjust herbs and spices to your taste. This is considered a free ingredient, nutritionally speaking, so add as little or as much to your recipes and experiment with different herbs and combinations of them. However, I should note that high concentrations of some herbs may interact with medications, so always consult your doctor if you're significantly increasing your herb consumption. When purchasing dried herbs, you've probably seen some blends like poultry seasoning or herbs de Provence, or more common, Italian seasoning, which you'll find in many seasoned recipes. We strive to keep our ingredient lists short and affordable, so this 5-in-1 blend shows up frequently because it is highly available, versatile, and adds a lot of flavor. It's usually a blend of oregano, rosemary, thyme, basil, and marjoram. If you have all or some of these dried herbs, you can make your own blend with equal parts of each. And when purchasing this or other spice or herb blends, try to look for ones that are salt-free so that you have a little more control over your overall sodium intake. Sometimes fresh herbs aren't available or frankly too expensive, especially if you just need a small amount. So if you don't have a garden and you need to substitute dried for fresh herbs, that is totally okay. The rule of thumb is to use 1/3 of the amount of dried for fresh. As we talked about earlier, since fresh herbs are mostly water, the dried version is highly concentrated, so you need much less. This means that if a recipe calls for 1 tablespoon fresh rosemary, you'll want to use 1 teaspoon dried because there are 3 teaspoons in 1 tablespoon. The same rule applies in reverse. If a recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of dried parsley, you can use 1 tablespoon fresh. Keep in mind that when you convert fresh herbs to dry, it's always easier to add more than to take away. So err on the side of caution and add more to taste while cooking. This goes for all seasoning. Build flavor gradually. Just remember that dried herbs need a bit of time to release their flavor. That's why soups and stews taste better the next day. In addition to swapping out dried for fresh, you can also mix and match similar herbs. For example, basil and mint not only go well together, but can also be substituted for the other. Same for rosemary and thyme. Listed here are some other helpful swaps. We've covered a lot, but let's get to what everyone here is probably wondering. How do we keep fresh herbs from spoiling so fast? How can we possibly use them all up in time? Am I right? I'm curious, again, from all of you, tell me in the chat if you've ever purchased fresh herbs with the best of intentions and they went bad. Maybe it was some mushy cilantro or some dried, dusty thyme that just went totally brown. Yep, cilantro is one of the toughest ones. Yep, and basil. It does happen a lot. It happens to everyone, and that is why we are here today. Yes, that's it looks like someone here has a garden. That is wonderful. So we've all done this, and I've got some tips to help prevent this. First up is during menu planning. If you are planning to make a dish that calls for fresh basil, for example, consider making some other dishes the same week that also call for fresh basil. Here are 3 popular but different season recipes that all use fresh basil. Taking into consideration overlapping ingredients is truly the best piece of advice I can offer to reduce food waste and grocery costs. To find recipes with certain ingredients, you can use the search bar in the Season Recipe app to enter ingredients you want to use up, which is a pretty helpful tool. If you're not much of a meal planner and you prefer to throw things together based on what you already have on hand, here are some ideas to use up some fresh herbs. You can really sprinkle them on anything: eggs, pasta, rice dishes, stir fries, roasted vegetables and meats. You can add them to salad dressings and marinades. If you have a whole bunch of herbs, consider making a pesto or a chimichurri sauce. I found myself with way too much mint recently, so I added some to my water to feel a little fancy. I added some to a smoothie, which was delightful, and the rest of it I made into a tea. You can get really creative. But maybe you're going out of town, or you just don't have time to make anything with all these herbs. So before you throw them in the trash or let them mutate in the back of your vegetable crisper drawer, let me show you a few other options. I'm going to jump into the kitchen now for the demo. I'll be right back. Hello again. Welcome to my kitchen. Let me just see what's going on in the chat here. I'm going to have Jess drop some of these questions into the Q&A. And then at the end of this demo, I will go through all of your questions. Thank you so much. All right, so as promised, we're going to talk about some ways to store herbs so that they don't go bad so fast. Based on what we talked about with woody versus fresh herbs, we know that different types of herbs have different compositions. Some are more delicate, some are more hardy, and so therefore require some different types of storage. Woody herbs are at more of a risk of getting dry, whereas leafy herbs are more at risk of getting kind of soggy and mushy. So there are a couple different ways to prevent both of those things from happening. So we're going to start with the diva of all herbs, the one that is the most finicky. It doesn't like sunlight. It doesn't like cold. It doesn't like heat. It doesn't like anything, is fresh basil. So I just pulled this out of the fridge. This is how it came from the store. I had it stored in the refrigerator door because that is the least cold part of the refrigerator. And I just bought it yesterday, so it's still looking good. And the way that basil best is stored, like I said, it's the diva of the herbs. It wants to be a flower and it needs to be treated like a flower. And so how we do that is we keep it in water. I have here a jar. Let me fix the camera here so you can see what I'm doing. Okay. So I have a little bit of water in this jar. You can use a vase, you can use a glass, whatever you want. And we're just going to add the basil right in here. We just want the stems in the water. We don't want the leaves to get in there because we don't want them to touch it because they'll get a little bit too soft. So then what we're going to do is we're going to put a plastic bag, a loose, you can use any kind of plastic bag you want, just over the top of these herbs. And we're going to store this on the kitchen counter out of the direct sunlight, maybe just right over here. And if you store your basil like this, it will stay for up to a full week, which is pretty great. If you don't need your basil to last a whole week, you just need it for a couple of days, then you can, by all means, just keep it in the original packaging in the door of the refrigerator, like I mentioned, where it's not so cold. For some of the less sensitive but still delicate herbs, we have here parsley and cilantro. It still has the wire on it that comes from the way that it comes from the grocery store, so you can see what I do with it. So before we get into that, I want to show you the difference between parsley and cilantro because they're often confused for one another. So we're going to take a close look at parsley, and this one's a little floppy, and cilantro. So as you can see here, the cilantro has more rounded leaves, whereas the parsley has more pointy leaves. Another way to tell the difference between the two is if you're at the store and you can't tell them apart, parsley usually has a little bit of a darker green to it, whereas where cilantro is usually a little bit less dark in color. You can also smell it. Parsley has a really mild, herbaceous, sort of grassy aroma, and cilantro has a stronger sort of metallic, citrusy smell and taste, and soapy also to some people. There's also, this is Italian parsley, by the way, that we are talking about today. There's also curly parsley. Most of the recipes that we use at Season are using Italian parsley. We prefer it. It's easier to chop. It's easier to chew. It's just also my preference, but by all means, use curly if you want, or if that's what's available to you. The way that I like to store parsley and cilantro, when I get it from the store, is I take off the, what do we call this wire tag. And what I do is I take some paper towel, and this has already been washed and dried. If this is still a little bit wet, then you don't need to dampen your paper towel. If it's dry, then you're going to want to use a damp paper towel. This is still a little bit damp. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to roll this parsley right into a nice little burrito. And I'm going to steal this for a minute and keep it in a Ziploc bag or a cloth bag if you have one. Cotton works really well. And make sure you get all the air out and just roll it up and keep it in the fridge. This technique will keep your herbs like parsley, cilantro, chives, dill, what else? Marjoram if you're using it. This will last 1 to 2 weeks like this. You may need to redampen the paper towel and it'll last a little bit longer. So then we get into our woody herbs. We have some thyme today, no pun intended. And since woody herbs are more at risk of drying out, what we're going to do is another technique. We can do the same thing as we did before with the parsley. We can roll it in a paper towel, or another method that works for most herbs is to take a container like a Tupperware and again use some damp paper towel or a kitchen towel like this and just put the thyme directly inside. Cover it with more damp paper towel, cover it up, put it in the fridge, and you're good to go. Another technique, as you can see here in the background, if it's not too small, I'll put this down, is to tie up a bundle of dried thyme or rosemary if you have a lot of it and you need to use it up, and hang this for 3 weeks in a dry place like the corner of a kitchen or maybe your garage, and then you can easily strip it from the stems, which I can show you real quickly. This works for both fresh and dried herbs as well as rosemary and oregano. So here you can see the herbs are growing upward. So you just pinch it and you pull down. You just strip them right off of the stem, and then you have a little bit of thyme here. You can do the same thing for the top of the stem that we didn't get. We can just go from the opposite direction. And since thyme is already these tiny little leaves, we don't really need to chop them up. However, if you're using rosemary, they're bigger, coarser leaves, you are going to want to chop those up. And then last thing is, if you have a lot of chopped herbs that you have left over from cooking that you didn't need, one really good trick is to put them in ice cube trays, cover it with water or olive oil, stick it in the freezer, and then you have these little flavor bombs that you can add to all sorts of different dishes. That's a really good hack for coconut milk or tomato paste or all kinds of like odds and ends that you don't want to throw away and are probably going to need little bits of. All right, so that's all I have for today. Let's jump into the Q&A. Okay. So one question is, can you freeze them? So yes, as I had just mentioned a moment before, let me just situate my, here we go, that's better. Yes, you can freeze herbs, like I mentioned. Another way that you can freeze herbs is to wash them, dry them, chop them, throw them in the freezer, and then once they're frozen, put them in a little baggie. You don't necessarily have to submerge them to freeze them. Can you make chili powder using garden grown chili peppers? That's a great question. So chilies are their own family. There's herbs, there's spices, and there's chilies, among other things. That's a great question. I would definitely make my own chili powder. If you have a dehydrator, you can seed your chilies, put them in the dehydrator or put them in the oven, or even dry them similarly to how we dried the thyme. And then you'll want to, you can put them in a food processor or even a coffee grinder to make chili powder. When using fresh herbs, should you discard all stems and just use the leafy portion for better flavor? That's a great question. So when we instruct people to chop cilantro in seasoned recipes, we generally tell people to chop the leaves and the soft, tender stems because they're so soft and they're very full of flavor, and we don't want to waste that much. So for herbs like cilantro and other soft, delicate leafy herbs, we tend to also chop the stems. Sometimes, like with parsley, the stems are kind of crunchy and maybe too fibrous, in which case sometimes I'll just use the herbs, the leaves, and I'll compost the stems. And then as far as the stems of the woody herbs, that's a great thing to add to like a chicken stock, or if you, I always have like a bag of random scraps and odds and ends and herb stems and chicken bones. And when that bag gets full, I make a big batch of chicken stock. And the last question is, if you're a beginner of herbs and in the process of trying to lose weight, what herbs are the best ones to use? And I would say all of them. All fresh herbs are really wonderful for your health. They add a lot of flavor in place of things like sugar and salt and added fat. So I encourage you to experiment with all the different herbs, try combinations of them, try different dried ones, try different fresh ones, and see what you like best. And of course, talk to your dietitian and see what they can suggest for other ways for you to help you on your weight loss journey. So that is all for today. And if you're not already a member of Season and you're interested in signing up, you can do so for free at seasonhealth.com, where you will be emailed more notifications about webinars if you found this interesting and fun. There'll be more of those. And that's all for me today. Thank you again so much for joining. Thank you for joining me, especially for where it's late, if it's late where you are on the East Coast or wherever you're joining from tonight. Thanks and have a wonderful evening. Bye.